What I'm going to do is give a very brief overview of the state of nature and why its current state matters so much. Then to talk about what nature-based solutions are, providing some context and some definitions. I then want to talk about the role of, or the potential role of, nature-based solutions for addressing climate change, so climate change mitigation, and then take a deeper dive on the role of nature-based solutions for addressing climate change adaptation. And then I want to end up with a section talking about how we get good nature-based solutions, in other words, robust, sustainable and ethical nature-based solutions into policy and practice. And I'm very delighted that this talk will be followed by a real deep dive on the Costa Rica context. So I'm delighted that Ina will be following this. So as you will all be very aware, there have been several recent syntheses reports, such as the one produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and also the Living Planet report produced by ZSL and WWF last year. They paint a particularly bleak picture of the state of nature. So despite significant investment by the conservation community and major increase in protected area coverage across the globe, biodiversity is in free fall, and the health of our ecosystems and the people that depend upon those ecosystems with it. So here are some dismal headlines to start with. We know that humans have now modified over 50% of terrestrial land cover and use 40% of the globe's primary productivity. We know that natural ecosystems have declined in extent by 47%, and that related to this, up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction over the coming decades. We lose around, over 9 million hectares of tropical forest a year, and we have lost from our oceans and our lands over 80% of our animal biomass. So we've recorded basically an 82% decline in wild mammals on land and an 80% decline in wild fish in the oceans. And that's just in the past 100 years, but most of that loss of biomass has been in the past 30 to 40 years. We've lost 23% of biotic integrity, so that's the abundance of naturally present species. And between 1970 and 2016, there's been an average decline in the population sizes of our mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles and fish by an average of 68%. Note that this varies across the globe, ranging from around 20% in the North America, but up to 94% in the Americas and Central and South America. So yes, biodiversity and the health of our ecosystems are in free fall, but at the same time, we have the deeply interrelated challenge of climate change. So despite knowing the existential threat posed by climate change for very many decades now, we know, you will all be aware, that emissions are still very much on the rise. Last week reaching 420 parts per million, and that's more than they have been for at least 800,000 years. And as a result of these emissions, you will be aware, of course, that we are nearly 1 degree warmer on average since pre-industrial times, and we are currently on a course for 2 to 4 degrees by the end of the century. And we know that this is already spelling havoc for people and for businesses and communities all over the world. But not only are we failing to stabilise the climate or stem the tide of biodiversity loss, but this is clearly, undermining many of the development gains of the 20th century. And as this community knows better than any, this is increasing, poverty and inequality around the world. So indeed, last year in its global risk assessment, the World Economic Forum listed extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, and natural disasters as the top 3 risks in terms of both likelihood and impact to the global economy and human well-being around the world. In terms of the next most impactful risks came water crises and biodiversity loss. And this sort of picture is in fact the one that the WEF has been painting for the last 5 years or so. But in many ways, this is a sort of misleading picture, as in reality, and as this audience is particularly aware, these are deeply interwoven challenges, deeply interwoven risks. And we can't address any one of these challenges in isolation. And it's become very apparent that we need very integrated approaches, that these are the only viable and sustainable ones. Tackling all these 5 risks in a robust way will go a long way to tackling the other 4. But with these risks also come great opportunities. So last year in 2020, the risks of infectious diseases was placed there. In the 2021 global risk landscape, of course, infectious diseases moved up in terms of its risk. And it's become very clear, and a lot of my colleagues and you also have been involved in bringing together the evidence to support the fact that, the disruption, degradation, and the destruction of natural and semi-natural ecosystems is really at the root causes of many global challenges. And so it's against this backdrop that we've seen the rise of traction in this term nature-based solutions. So, put very simply, nature-based solutions involve working with and enhancing nature to address societal goals through the broad actions of protecting intact ecosystems, restoring and sustainably managing natural and semi-natural ecosystems, sustainable management of our working lands, so our timberlands and our croplands is included, and the creation of new ecosystems, particularly in and around our cities through green and through blue infrastructure. So stepping back a bit, this concept is deeply grounded in the knowledge from both science and, of course, from practice that healthy, biodiverse ecosystems produce a very diverse range of services on which human well-being ultimately depends. The other critical thing about nature-based solutions is that this concept recognizes that biodiversity loss and climate change share many of the same drivers and hence share some of the same solutions. So we know that land use change through industrial agriculture is responsible for 30% of declines in biodiversity, whilst also being the second biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So in theory, restoring our ecosystems can help with warming, whilst also slowing biodiversity loss. But of course, the extent to which nature can do this, the extent to which it brings all these benefits, depends on how we invest in and how we implement nature-based solutions. So there are various definitions of nature-based solutions. The term, just to provide a bit of context, the term was actually first used by the World Bank in a report in 2008, which was around looking at its adaptation and biodiversity outcomes of its investments in green infrastructure. This term was then adopted and formally defined by the IUCN when it became a major pillar of their work and has been ever since. And they defined nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously, and this is the crucial bit, providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Now, the European Commission also adopted the phrase nature-based solutions, but in their definition, they emphasized economic benefits and they also included solutions that were inspired by nature. But generally speaking, it is the IUCN definition which is the most widely used one, and it's this definition that then forms the basis of the IUCN global standard, which if we have time we might want to discuss. You'll be aware of there's been a proliferation of very similar green concepts, each with their own three-letter acronym that have been developing over many decades. Ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, forest and landscape restoration, and so forth. REDD+, nature's contributions to people, natural climate solutions. The power of nature-based solutions is as an umbrella concept that brings all these things together, recognizing that if we implement nature-based solutions for the very broad benefits that they bring, there won't then be perverse outcomes for certain sorts of outcomes. So we don't want to just focus on, for example, on the climate change mitigation benefits of nature, because that may well trade off against biodiversity or adaptation benefits. So some examples of nature-based solutions are given here. I mean, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of examples of good nature-based solutions all over the world, because in reality, local communities have been working with nature for millennia to deal with the impacts of climate variability. And we have a huge amount to learn from those local communities. So in other words, the scientific community benefits massively from working with these communities. Some examples here: cocoa agroforestry in Sierra Leone. This is a scenario where agroforestry has been implemented to enhance and in some cases just stabilize the yields of cocoa crops. In this particular project, the approach is saving biodiversity loss and saving around 500,000 tons of carbon a year through avoided deforestation while supporting sustainable livelihoods. Community wetland projects in the Peruvian Andes. So many communities in the Andes are facing water shortages as the glaciers retreat, and communities have been restoring their wetlands, restoring their swamps and rewiggling their rivers in the high Andes. This is increasing carbon storage, improving the quality and the supply of water. It's also reducing landslides and critically also improving the quality of the habitat, in particular for local wild species such as vicuña. Meanwhile, in cities all over the world, communities and local governments are increasing tree covers in parks and along pavements, and there is a growing amount of data supporting that this significantly reduces daily temperatures during heat waves, and of course increases carbon sequestration whilst providing many well-documented mental and physical health benefits to people living in those areas. And across the UK, we have many examples. It's really important to showcase these examples. I think this year the UK needs to show that it is getting its own house in order to inspire global action globally. And there are many examples of communities, of businesses, of farmers working together across different landscapes, improving the quality of their ecosystems. This is helping with flood mitigation, it's locking in carbon, it's improving habitat for wildlife in many different contexts, in cities, in the highlands, in the wetlands and the coastal zones. So I won't talk about these in details, but there are lots of more examples of nature-based solutions in action around the UK and around the globally on the case studies page of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative website. So I want to then focus now really on the potential for nature-based solutions to deliver climate change mitigation benefits. We know that nature-based solutions, the restoration and protection of our ecosystems, can reduce emissions arising from our use of lands and oceans while also securing stocks. We know that land, agriculture, forestry and other land use activities account for around 13% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, while the land sink can absorb around 29% and the ocean sink approximately 24% of CO2 emissions. The fact of the matter is, though, the biosphere has the potential to remove and store considerably more carbon and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The question is, how much more? Well, as you'll probably appreciate, estimating the global potential of nature-based solutions for mitigation is extremely challenging indeed. It's complex. The models must come well restrained and constrained with, and have many issues need to be taken into account when developing these models. For example, there needs to be biodiversity safeguards. We can only restore ecosystems, we can only restore forest ecosystems, for example, in areas that are actually appropriate for growing forests. We need to think about the saturation of ecosystem carbon sequestration rates. As a forest is growing, it is a net carbon sink, but once it has reached its maximum capacity, there is a balance between emissions of CO2 through respiration and absorption through photosynthesis, and that needs to be taken into account. We need to think about food security, fiber security, and these models are very sensitive to the cost of carbon. So current models that have been developed by all sorts of various groups across the world do take these factors into account as best they can. However, current estimates do not take into account complexities around land rights, conflicts between land ownership and management, inequalities and so forth. There is currently a lack of robust scientific information about the role of marine ecosystems in the global carbon balance. And the elephant in the room often when it comes to talking about the role of nature-based solutions in climate change is the impact of climate change on the biosphere. The continued warming of the biosphere is undermining its capacity to act as a carbon dioxide sink, as fires across Australia and California and other regions have demonstrated recently. Recently, this is a figure that was out in a paper that came out in Nature last week, showed the potential for cost-effective mitigation from nature-based solutions on the land. And the basic finding is, and there is general agreement across the different research groups working in this area, that nature-based solutions, if scaled up to the maximum extent possible across the land, could save around 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. 4 gigatons of this comes from protecting our intact lands. 4 comes from more sustainable management of our working lands, our agricultural lands or crop lands and so forth. And 2 gigatons, so only 20%, comes from restoring native cover. How much carbon dioxide is 10 gigatons? Well, If we times this cube, this turquoise cube, by 36 million, you get a visualization of the amount of carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere every year. What we've found is nature-based solutions could absorb at most 10 million of these. In other words, around 27% of anthropogenic emissions. We recently modelled this with respect to the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And we find that this is equivalent to reducing peak warming by around 0.3 of a degree if we peak at 2 degrees towards the end of the century by 2075. But this will only happen, and this is what's very important to remember, is if we decarbonise and if nature-based solutions are properly implemented. Otherwise, the warming that will result from a lack of decarbonisation, from not keeping fossil fuels in the ground, will undermine the health of the ecosystems and turn them into net sources rather than net sinks of carbon dioxide. So actually, the concept of nature-based solutions really has its roots in climate change adaptation rather than mitigation. And there are three pathways that I wanted to describe to you by which nature-based solutions can support human adaptation to climate change. They can do so by reducing exposure to climate hazards, reducing sensitivity to them, and critically by building adaptive capacity. So these are some examples in the ways in which implementation of different broad categories of nature-based solution can support human adaptation or can reduce exposure. Protecting our grasslands, forests and wetlands. There's lots of evidence that this can secure and regulate our water supplies, shield communities and infrastructure from floods, erosion and landslides. Restoration of our coastal wetlands and reefs can protect against storms, saltwater intrusion and erosion. Improved management of our working lands can stabilise and in some cases enhance yields in drier, more variable climates. And the creation, for example, through establishment of green and blue infrastructure in our cities can help with cooling and flood abatement while reducing air pollution and, as I say, providing many health benefits. And I put a link here in, which I'll also share in the chat, of a recent study that brings all the evidence together for the role of nature-based solutions in reducing exposure. I mean, most of the evidence that nature can help, implementing nature-based solutions can help reduce our exposure to the impacts of climate change come from the coastal zone. As you know, it's clearly it is the coastal ecosystems and the communities that depend upon them that really are at the front line of climate change. And there is a large body of evidence from modelling, experimental lab and field studies that show that mangroves, seagrass beds, coral reefs, oyster beds, salt marshes and so forth can attenuate, reduce wave height and attenuate wave energy. They can bind soils and stabilise coastal regions and the shores and slow saltwater intrusion. But there is also, as I've mentioned, growing evidence base as well, that in a very different context, that is within our cities, that increasing tree cover, increasing areas of parks, connecting up those nature-based solutions across cities can moderate the effects of heat waves during the hottest times of year and also can manage storm water and flooding in urban areas. The second way is by reducing sensitivity. So this is the degree to which individuals, communities and societies and ecosystems are actually affected by the impacts they experience. And we know that nature-based solutions can secure diverse sources of food and income. So in other words, providing financial and nutritional security during climate extremes when crops or other sources of income fail. So there's lots of examples of this. For example, in Vanuatu, marine protected areas, most of the time they're there to protect the biodiversity. But when terrestrial-based livelihoods, such as those dependent on rice, are reduced through, for example, droughts arising through the El Nino effect, these marine protected areas can be temporarily opened to fishing as a source of food and income for local communities. That's just one example in the way in which nature can be managed to reduce the sensitivity of communities dependent upon it. And the third way, just as, if not more important than the others I've described, is by implementing nature-based solutions can enhance adaptive capacity, that is the ability to innovate or adjust in response to changing conditions. And there's a nice example of from a mangrove restoration project in Quezon province in the Philippines. because human capital, social capital, is built through the implementation of nature-based solutions alongside natural capital. The social bonds increase, the flow of knowledge increases within these communities, and those communities are then ready to deal with other changes, whatever they may be, other shocks and changes and perturbations in the system, or whatever they may be in future. And there's some wonderful evidence from practice around the world showing the importance of social capital, the growth of social capital during the implementation of nature-based solutions. So nature helps us to adapt in climate change in multiple ways. And this is just a figure that shows that very effectively in simple terms, which was produced by the Global Adaptation Commission in their 2019 report. But the critical thing is, very relevant for the narrative at the moment, that these can also help stimulate the economy. Here's an example of the local economics of nature-based solutions in Bangladesh. Between 1988 and 2018, the loss of forests and mangroves from urban expansion resulted in a loss of around $118 million worth of ecosystem services. And what this study showed, that if the rate of destruction of that ecosystem continued, that there would be a further $41 million lost. And ecosystem services lost. If what mangroves were left were protected, then there would be an increase in value of $60 million. If those ecosystems were protected and the ones that had been damaged or destroyed were restored, then you would see benefits of over $131 million worth of ecosystem services. Global economics of avoided loss and damage with nature-based solutions. Well, there's a lot of evidence for this. These are some sort of key examples. We know that the benefits of mangrove restoration through fisheries, forestries, recreation and disaster risk reduction are estimated to be up to 10 times the costs. That nature-based coastal defence projects are between 2 and 5 times more cost effective compared to engineered structures. Critically, salt marshes protect over $20 billion worth of property during hurricanes each year. And we know from a global modelling study that annual damages from flooding would double and costs from storms would triple in the absence of reefs globally. Nature-based solutions, investments in nature-based solutions doesn't just provide benefits, economic benefits in terms of natural capital over the long term, it can also stimulate economic development in the short term. And we know that, for example, for every $1 million invested in coastal habitat restoration in the USA, 40 new jobs are created, compared to 19 for investment in the aviation industry, 7 for finance, and 5 critically for oil and gas. And according to the Food and Land Use Coalition in their report published last year, that new investment of $350 billion a year in sustainable food and land use systems could create more than 120 million new jobs and $4.5 trillion worth of business opportunities globally each year by 2030. So just wanted to wrap up a bit more with the overview of nature-based solutions in the broad and international policy context. So we've discussed how nature-based solutions can bring multiple benefits, from carbon sequestration, disaster risk reduction, ecosystem protection, sustainability across multiple sectors. And as such, they can unite, or have the potential to unite, multilateral agreements. And there is, as you will be aware, huge governmental and non-governmental and indeed private sector interest in nature-based solutions. I won't go through all these, you can read them on the slide here, but enormous amounts of interest and at least high-level pledges in nature-based solutions in various ways. One of the problems is, though, that the high-level intentions for nature-based solutions are not met by robust science-based targets. For example, although 66% of Paris Agreement signatories include nature-based solutions in their nationally determined contributions in one way or another, in the current versions, although this is changing in some cases, but many important ecosystems are overlooked. Wetlands, mangroves, peatlands and grasslands barely feature, whereas there is an emphasis on commercial plantations. The targets don't take biodiversity into account. They're usually about the area of forest rather than the quality of habitat. And then you've got something like the Bonn Agreement, which, as you will know, is a global goal to restore 350 million hectares by 2030. The problem is at least 45% of those commitments involve low diversity commercial plantations. And there is a major problem with a focus on afforestation as a climate solution. So just to be clear, the term afforestation refers to the planting of trees, usually exotic tree species, in areas that are naturally treeless. So ancient grasslands, dry lands, tropical forest areas, which have obviously are naturally forested, but in some cases, afforestation, so the planting of exotic tree species in those areas, can threaten them. The big problem with the focus on afforestation as a climate solution is that it distracts from the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And as I've said, and as the science clearly shows, unless we rapidly decarbonise, global heating will damage our ecosystems beyond recovery and to turn them into net sources of carbon dioxide, of greenhouse gases. Plantations also offer very short-term, high-risk carbon stores. We know that much of the harvested wood is for short-lived products. So it's all about getting the right species in the right places, a term you'll have heard a lot over the last year or two. So whilst healthy, intact, biodiverse forests and other ecosystems are part of the climate solution, a crop of trees is not. As I mentioned, there is a problem that afforestation can threaten other critically important habitats, such as wetlands, peatlands, grasslands, which are rich in both carbon and biodiversity. And in many parts of the world, natural forests are often replaced by plantations, leading to a net loss of biodiversity and carbon. And in many cases, these interventions can overlook human rights. And we always have to be mindful on whose land will all these trees be planted. So there are 4 overarching policy guardrails for successful, sustainable nature-based solutions. And these are written out here on the slide, that nature-based solutions are part of the climate solution, but are not a substitute for rapid fossil fuel phase-out. They involve the protection and restoration of a wide range of naturally occurring ecosystems. They are implemented with the full consent and engagement of local communities, and they sustain or enhance a diversity of native species. What I wanted to do at the end here is just play you a short animation.
Nature-based solutions can help fight climate change, biodiversity loss, and poverty. We live in a world where landscapes are dominated by farming and infrastructure, with very little space left for nature. Yet nature is our life support system, and with 1 million species at risk of extinction and extreme events increasing as the planet warms, people are suffering. But we can, and we must choose a different future. Nature-based solutions involve protecting our natural ecosystems, not just our forests, but also our peatlands, our wetlands, grasslands and marine habitats, through locally led projects that support communities. They encompass restoring degraded habitats, cleaning rivers and allowing them to meander again, and bringing microbes, plants and animals back into damaged landscapes. Nature-based solutions involve sustainably managing our working lands and fisheries and replenishing soil health. For example, by growing trees among crops and planting more hedgerows. And nature-based solutions also include bringing nature into our towns and cities, with connected parks, allotments, green roofs and ponds. But biodiversity must be at the foundation of all these activities, for it is only when ecosystems thrive that they can support people over the long term. And nature-based solutions can also only be sustained if they are designed and implemented by local communities, respecting indigenous knowledge, cultural traditions and human rights. In this way, people and nature co-produce a variety of outcomes which benefit society, which in turn feed back to support biodiversity. Protecting nature can store carbon, whilst restoring it can draw greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And in this way, nature-based solutions can help to slow climate change this century. Restoration of habitats on slopes and in catchments can store water and stabilise soils, protecting our homes and crops by reducing the risk of floods, erosion and landslides. Healthy coastal ecosystems are also crucial for protecting communities from the impacts of storm surges, saltwater intrusion and erosion. While in our towns and cities, trees in parks and along pavements provide shelter from the sun and rain and reduce peak temperatures during heat waves, and by bringing nature into our cities, we can also improve our mental and our physical health. Nature-based agricultural practices can help to sustain or even enhance yields, securing food supplies and ensuring clean drinking water is available year-round. Furthermore, the restoration of our lands and seas can generate valuable jobs and provide diverse livelihoods, while securing supply chains. And in this way, nature-based solutions can support economic recovery all over the world. Nature has diverse cultural values, including enjoyment of natural beauty and spiritual and religious connections, all the while bringing education, recreation and health benefits. Through implementing nature-based solutions, people build stronger relationships, networks and knowledge, which gives them the capacity to adapt and to be resilient in a rapidly changing world. All of these benefits and more support human well-being and biodiversity, which are, in turn, the foundation of sustainable development.